Assassin's Creed Odyssey is the latest installment of the iconic Assassin's Creed franchise. Much like the title implies, it takes place in Greece, where you take on the mantle of a classical Greek hero and unfold your own Odyssey. For the first time in franchise history, you can either choose a male or female protagonist, with a nearly identical story playing out full of Greek tragedy, war, comedy, and treachery as you uncover a secret cult pulling the strings of the Greek world. Also, unlike many of the previous Assassin's Creed games, this particular iteration is marketed as a action RPG and not an exclusive stealth-themed game that the franchise was built off of. However, it does borrow heavily from previously implemented game mechanics, ranging from a stripped-down version of ship combat, a fluid combat system, and a more fast-paced stealth mechanic. Of course, I will be going into more detail on these individual aspects throughout this review, but I would like to circle back around and address the story and theme of Odyssey in comparison to the previous titles. Now, I have been playing video games for quite some time, and I in fact have played every Assassin's Creed game to date, with the exception of the most recent Origins. So I was very excited to get back into the world of Assassins, and at the same time, very disappointed with where the story led, and the lackluster real-world sections of gameplay not actually in the Animus. In fact, if you stripped out the real-world segments and the subtle nods to the extraterrestrial deities now that have been established in earlier parts of the franchise, you would not know that this was an Assassin's Creed game. Which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I was expecting something closer to its roots. I hate to spoil too much, but at no point in time does the lead character ever undergo the assassin ritual or become inducted into the Assassin's Creed in any way. In fact, there's no mention of the Creed. They are just a Greek hero in a game called Assassin's Creed, which is one of the many problems I do have with the actual story as it's played out. Since there is no relation to the actual Assassin's Order, or even the Templar Order for that matter, why is this character important to the franchise? Are they going to be inserted into later timelines? I don't know, and perhaps this is the ultimate plan. But the current narrative, while interesting, in my mind, is not an Assassin's Creed game. While the story of Alexios or his sister and the cult of Cosmos is interesting, it's nothing really new. It's all tread water from the current franchise. The overall narrative, and with the exception of an optional discovery of Atlantis, does not add anything to the franchise. I would like to expand more into this, but for the sake of spoilers and length, let's move on to our next section. As far as gameplay mechanics, Assassin's Creed Odyssey is even more of a derivative than its predecessors from the main character. Gone are the days of spending meticulous time scoping out targets and planning out the perfect assassination. Now, we are more in the favor of a dulled-down assassination mechanic that as much encourages melee combat as stealth, turning into the once stealth-oriented game into a full-fledged action/RPG with some slight stealth elements. And I do say action game, as enemies and yourself are capable of taking massive amounts of damage, which in previous titles, a much more realistic approach to melee combat was used, and even ranged combat for that matter. And assassinations were actually mandatory to progress the story, as well as getting into and out of brawls, being highly discouraged as you would quickly be put down. Unless you were just highly skilled, you would not be able to take on one or two more enemies at a time in the older games. Odyssey, however, encourages brawls and almost discourages stealth at some points, when not story appropriate, of course. As often your assassination targets can not be killed in a single assassination attempt. You can make the attempt, it will not be enough to kill them probably 8 or 9 times out of 10. Meaning that when you need to take down the bandit captain of the bandit camp, unless you have heavily invested into your assassination skill with the appropriate gear, you will have to engage in melee combat, as inevitably your assassination will fall short of killing them. And speaking of skills, there is a very rudimentary RPG system in place that allows you to dump points into either melee, ranged, or assassination skills. This, coupled with a gear system to increase damage output and a multitude of other bonuses, aims to make your character more unique, but there is no consequences to respeccing your character at any point besides a small monetary fee, and thus is more of an annoyance than anything, as you can just dump all your points into warrior before heading into the arena, and then after respec into assassin or hunter, or both as many times as you want. This leads to more of a skill limiting tree than an actual RPG skill tree, as you can only have so many active at a time to begin with, but then in a traditional RPG where stats increase are permanent and force you to play the way you are developing your character, this system does not. It doesn't reward you for sticking to a certain archetype. And this brings to mind one of the fundamental flaws with the game as it stands now. Odyssey is a game that tries to do it all, a jack of all trades if you would, but it has lost that special something that made the franchise Assassin's Creed very unique amongst the video game world, especially when it came out. This can't be any more evident than the fact that the assassinations have been played down so much. The entire system involving multiple assassin takedowns and blending into your environment are completely absent from this game. Which then leads me into the gameplay choices that were made, or more precisely not made, when implementing this title. Now, it is a personal preference of mine that when something is added to a franchise, future titles, unless they are completely breaking the mold, jumping genres, things like that, those mechanics should carry over in the new systems that they have introduced. The entire stealth system in Odyssey is more dulled down than the original Assassin's Creed. We're talking about a game that is more than 10 years old, and yet had more stealth ingenuity than Odyssey. It's just mind-boggling to me. In the original, there was anything from keeping your distance and listening into gossip, shadowing a character, to slipping through a crowd. That was a very Assassin's Creed thing. Casually slipping into a crowd, blending into your environment, and avoiding pursuit. All of that is absent from Odyssey. The best you can get is hiding in the bushes, or jumping into a thing of hay. That's it. Not that you even need to, because now you can just take on pretty much anything the game can throw at you if you've got your skills high enough or prepped appropriately. Now, not only does Odyssey not embrace it, but it takes away the multi-stealth kill possibilities. That was a very, very big selling point for me in the previous franchises. The ability to, you come up on two guards, you come behind them, and you can assassinate both of them. That's completely gone from Odyssey. Now, the way they kind of did it is they have this kind of bizarre teleport knife strike thing, which is, it looks cool. It's very much not realistic. But then again, launching your opponents 20 feet into the air by bashing your fist in the ground makes about as much sense as that. And that is what has been lost, a sense of realism. The Assassin's Creed franchise, even though its gameplay has always had a relatively straightforward idea of realism and plausibility, with the exception of probably jumping off ridiculously tall buildings and living, there's always been a bit of realistic undertones. But Odyssey has completely shed this for more of a dulled down, light/heavy combat style with over-the-top moves and abilities. Now, I'm not saying that I don't enjoy those things. I'm simply trying to make the point that this is radically different from the previous titles, and I honestly don't see why they made such a divergence from it. Couple that with the fact that the RPG elements almost have no weight to them, and the enemies scale with you. Meaning that from level 1 to level 50, you will have the same difficulty in combat with simply a little flair, and maybe your NPC looks a little bit cooler, or your character does. No matter where in the world you travel, you can go back to the island you started on. The guards there are just as tough as the guards you'll face in Athens. So, there is that. Now, it does seem like I'm ranting, and honestly, it feels like a rant at this point, so let's get into something a little more positive. Now, as far as graphics and voice acting are concerned, the production value in Odyssey is top-notch. You can tell this is a AAA title, and Ubisoft has spared no expense in making the game beautiful. This is really told through the very well choreographed and shot cutscenes, and the ocean especially. The movement and the flow of the ocean and just the look. It's so alive with animals, there's pirates, there's inclement weather. It's just beautiful. Seeing as how you spend a great deal of time either on a beach or on your personal ship, the extent to which the development team went to make sure the graphics were stable and the game ran properly has weighed very heavily in my final verdict in their favor. Especially the voice acting, which honestly was one of the best parts about Odyssey, as the character interaction were often much more memorable and engaging than the main storyline. And I found myself more interested in the side characters and what was going on with them than the main character, and especially the cult. And for the most part, the game runs very smoothly. It runs at a smooth frame rate. I only had a few instances of graphical tears, and then just graphics not loading, and of course just flat out bugs, which is very impressive for as massive an open world title as Odyssey. Couple that with the fact that there's almost no load times. Once you load into the game, unless you fast travel, there's very few instances where the game has to catch up. It does happen, especially later, in Athens especially it does this, but for the most part there's almost zero load times, which is very impressive. Now, most games of this size and scope are just rife with bugs, crashes, and terrible dialogue, which Odyssey does have some, but there's much more good than bad. So as far as a graphical standpoint and a running standpoint, I give Odyssey a big thumbs up. But then when it comes into actual gameplay, that's where it starts to fall a little short. Like I said, it's the jack of all trades, master of none. Everything's just a little bland. There's nothing that really stands out about Odyssey. If I asked myself to pick out a certain gameplay mechanic that I thought was just so cool, I couldn't pick one out because they're all generic. They're all generic mechanics taking from other games over the years. Now, if they really would have really heavily invested in the stealth, like the previous titles, I could probably pick that out. Like, hey, do you remember when you could do this or that? And it just isn't there anymore. They've lost it. They've ditched it in favor of a much more broad kind of gameplay, which does appeal to some people, just not to me personally. And of course, with a game of this length, you're going to have problems with repetition, but that is pretty much any game that is open world and massive as this one. Now, as a whole, Assassin's Creed Odyssey is an attempt by Ubisoft to keep the franchise going after the conclusion of their main protagonist prior to Origins. Now, in order to shake up the gameplay, a distinctive move has been placed on the more broad open-world sandbox mechanics and less on the stealth-oriented gameplay of the past. This appears to be an attempt to capture a broader audience with the inclusion of a RPG-style customization and the jack-of-all-trades approach to the core mechanics. Although, in my personal opinion, if you haven't guessed it already, this makes the new iteration of Assassin's Creed an Assassin's Creed game in name only. It's lost all of that special traits that it once had that made the franchise a hit all those years ago. But this, of course, is only my humble opinion. As a whole, the game is very well made and polished, and by no means is it bad. In fact, it boasts a surprising amount of gameplay hours for what you're paying when compared to many other titles coming out these days. Now, in conclusion, Odyssey is an excellent game, but a subpar Assassin's Creed game. It's pretty much just living off the hype of its predecessors when it comes to the name. For this reason, I'm willing to give Assassin's Creed Odyssey a 7 out of 10. Originally, the score was lower, but I felt like I wasn't being very fair. It's not a bad game, but certainly not mind-blowing in any way except probably the visual department. Now, my bias for the old games could be shining through here, and perhaps I'm being a tad too harsh in my verdict. Feel free to let me know down in the comments section your own opinions on Odyssey, and as always guys, I have been Jumbo Thick. Thank you for watching. I hope you got something constructive from this review. I'm trying to not be as hypocritical. It can be hard sometimes. And I look forward to hearing from you in the comment section and making sure that your voices are heard. As always guys, have a good day, and I hope to see you guys soon.